as your research has been very useful for this subject, but I'd like to bring up the case study that I did last year for a paper on Kenya. It's a critical view of the Kenyan media system through the lens of the journalists. I have obviously based the paper on literature from about the independence of journalists, about regulation of the media, its political economy, and there's plenty of literature on this subject actually to be found. It's also been found by a number of academics that liberalized media is in fact susceptible to both political influence, business interests, and market pressure. This is the case in most parts of the world actually, but can become much more problematic in a fragile state, and has been problematic, I think, in Kenya. So the field study is, it was interviews with about 15 journalists who came from both broadcasting, radio, TV, and print media, and I wanted to simply find out how the practice of journalism is related to the structure of the media system, and what is thrown up in the interviews, what's come out of those interviews has been quite interesting. I think it has some relevance here. I divided into a thematic analysis of the interviews. The journalists all talked about how the media is compromised by the owners and the advertisers and the politicians. Various degrees, obviously, for different media, depending on how dependent you are on advertising, for example. The role of the advertising is obviously varies, and depending on how much political direct influence there is over your particular media. But there is quite a, I mean, there are members of parliament, for example, who own radio stations. So obviously there's a direct influence there, but it can also be done indirectly in other ways. So it's also clear that the common norms and standards that are not upheld by any institution, this is worsened by the poor employment conditions and threats to journalists. So there isn't a structure supporting the journalists, and this is quite clear and comes out from the interviews. Another aspect is that there is a wide gap between the reporting that the journalists think that they should do. A lot of these journalists are very well aware of the issues, they're very astute, the young ones and the older ones. I was very impressed with their approach to their work, but some of them deliberately stay out of political reporting for fear of their safety, for example, finding it too tricky, and they feel also that it's frustrating how, even if you want to, you are not expected to do a lot of work by your employers because it's too costly, it's not commercially viable. So to go out in the countryside, for example, rather than stay in Nairobi, is an issue. The other theme that comes out is also referred to brown envelope journalism. The brown envelope, if you're not aware, is the little envelope with some cash, which can be just to cover lunch, or it could be more cash, but it's to encourage you to come to a press conference, or to obviously buy your support or your allegiance, and that takes place quite routinely in many countries, and Kenya has its share of it, and it's brought up by the journalists as an issue. Who and what to expose can be influenced through bribes and other indirect means, and that was interesting. Journalists talking about that you can get paid to kill a story. So you start on an investigation, and then when you have something, you contact the people involved, and you can actually extract quite a lot of money or other material things, favors, whatever, to not continue to report on it. So privately owned media can, instead of championing democracy, be a part of a problem when you're trying to have a democratic system. Corruption in a transitional democracy often stems from the competing interest groups in the intermediate class vying for influence over government and the economy. this means institutions that are lacking legitimacy. That also leads to a contestation over the rules and a scope for corrupt practices. The institutions that regulate media in Kenya should be the Media Council of Kenya, and possibly the Kenya Union of Journalists. I think we could maybe talk more about that later. The judiciary is a given, that you have certain laws regulating media, and they can be quite used quite heavily to impede media freedom. Ethnicity is the other big issue that we can't avoid when we talk about Kenya. I haven't studied it closely, but it's clear that referring to ethnic groups in the mass media is probably unavoidable if you're going to have an open debate, but on the other hand, it can be very contentious how it is portrayed, how it is alluded to. There is a radio station in Nairobi broadcasting to this poor slum area where there was a lot of fighting after the last election results, and their policy is to just not speak about ethnic belonging at all, not even between the reporters in the station, making it almost like a taboo issue actually, but that's their way of simply saying that we're going to be one nation. Ethnicity is of course a very useful campaign tool. I want to understand this in this context. Speaking to a group trying to seek votes, you will be tempted, I think, to allude to ethnic belonging, the injustice against a group, for example, and it can easily come into it. And media will then relay what politicians said in the campaign speeches, and that's how I think some of the problems arise. So I have not given you the slide on ethnicity, but that's all right. Regulation is, of course, something I think is quite important here, and it's civil society generally clearly requires political constitutional defense, but the position of journalists is exposed in several ways. It's the employment conditions that weaken them in many ways. They have very little job security, which has an impact on your independent reporting. I can say this from my own experience working as a journalist. And there is also just the physical threat. Police can be quite brutal to journalists on different sites, on different locations. It's been quite bad, and so journalists feel they in different jobs they don't feel safe. Media has responsibility to the citizens. That I think could be regulated better. I wonder if we're going to be able to talk about that today, where it's somehow enforced, where media is forced to apologize when making mistakes, forcing them to be more cautious in how they report. But it is also the case that the media toes the line of government, which in turn will help their business interests. And here there should also be, again, some kind of way of protecting the independence of media against against that problem that threatens their independence. But this has to do with the market being so small, and in financial terms, and it's highly concentrated. The ownership is highly concentrated. The National Media Group, for example, is quite dominating, and it's worth pointing out in this context of regulation that they have forbidden their journalists to join a trade union, for example, and that makes I think that is an important issue in Kenya. So to conclude, I'd be saying that the media is being used as instruments for political actors in various ways, and lifting censorship, holding democratic elections seems to be almost like a recipe for conflict here. I'm sort of putting that out there, and we can discuss that, but there is definitely a need to transform the media institutions and its relationship to business and government. The open and inclusive mass media that everyone wants in Kenya certainly is elusive. In Kenya we see how this has a detrimental effect around each election, when misinformation, tendentious reporting, and rumor spreading heightens tensions. And it's actually what we saw in 2008 has happened before on a smaller scale, obviously, but has, I guess, I think it's quite important to remember that every election has actually been fought with violence, just not escalating out of hand as it did in 2008. A couple of questions that I'd like to put. I could actually keep that. I'm sort of running out of time. I'll keep that to later.
Elisebet, thanks very much.